All right, and we're live. This is the third time I've tried to record this. It's very different from what I am usually doing, and getting the audio balances just right. Honestly, it's been a struggle. So I'm going to try not to talk at the same time, and then when I do talk, I'm just going to mute them because I can't get it loud enough and yet still hear make it so you can hear me over what I'm saying, over what they're saying. So in the vein of trying to do more engineering things, sort of like traditional engineering as opposed to purely software. We're going to take a look today at the most recent. This is April. I've tried doing the one in January. I haven't seen the one in April yet. Recording of the Finance and Auditing Committee for the California High-Speed Rail Authority. So this is a or CAHSR. I don't know if it's an authority technically. This is a very interesting project that's been going on since 2008, and I'll go ahead and get it rolling here.
Good morning.
While they just sort of check in and ensure quorum. Get some closed captions just in case you want to know what they're saying. 2008 was Measure 1A, I think, Proposition 1A, about $8 billion in funding for the California high-speed rail effort. And that's sort of the unofficial kickoff or starting line that you typically look at this project for. We'll be approaching this primarily from the lens of sort of project engineering and look at modern project engineering and public engineering and public projects. It's a great example of how things can be really difficult and what sort of challenges you might run into. I'm also very interested in sort of the program finance and auditing role in this specific perspective of this committee, because as a California taxpayer, you really want to know, like, where's our train? Right. And it's very easy. It's not necessarily in a condescending way, but it's certainly the tide of public opinion is not particularly positive on this. And while it would be very easy for me to just go in and rant about this, I do genuinely want to look at sort of how the engineering and the program management pieces are related and what we can learn about listening to how the Finance and Auditing Committee operates. So let's listen in here.
15 seconds remaining. When it is your turn to speak, please slowly and clearly say your first and last name, and if applicable, state the organization you are representing. Mr. Chairman, our first speaker is Roll.
Okay, so here's a quick map. You hear some terms typically during these meetings. CP1 is the initial segment here, mostly through flat farmland, just a little bit north of Bakersfield to Merced. And that's what's under construction right now. I don't know how much rail they've laid. It's mostly right-of-way work, moving utilities around, getting sort of the overpasses and the viaducts constructed. CPs 2 and 3, or construction package, I believe, are these end segments to San Francisco and Los Angeles. And then yellow here is something called Brightline West. That's a separate effort. For the California high-speed rail, we can focus on this LA to San Francisco link. So let's listen to the CFO.
All right, thank you. Then, ladies and gentlemen, that will conclude the public comment for today's meeting. We will move on to agenda item number 1, which is the approval of our January 18th minutes. Any changes, additions, deletions?
I do love parliamentary procedure. There's something in the OCD engineer about me. It's like, yes, Roger's Rules of Order. Make this make sense, right?
Please call the roll. Yes.
Director Camacho?
Yes.
Vice Chair Miller?
Yes.
Director Gometti?
Okay, so they're going through roll call right now. One thing I'll mention is the initial bond was $8 billion. Since then, I think expenses at this point, including sort of pre-construction efforts for things they haven't opened ground on, are projected at $30 billion or so. And of course, that project started 16 years ago. So you can imagine there's a lot of issues with time and schedule controls. And they continue to update and try and figure out like where things are blocked, et cetera.
Completed their audit of our 21-22 fiscal year accounting records. And it was a what's called a clean audit, meaning no findings or misstatements in our year-end accounting statements. So
that's good. My understanding is that it has gotten better. That it was pretty messy for a number of years.
Fiscal year close. In March.
And of course, it's also the state checking the state. This isn't like an external accounting company auditing the program as a whole.
2022 raise grant award that funds the uh, configuration level.
So a lot of the other cash flow that they've raised after that $8 billion bond, obviously is completely spent by this point, if they're booked at $30 billion, has come from a number of federal grants, for example. It's come from raising funds in other ways like credits, cap and trade credits for what they project or what they book the savings will be.
We received in 2023.
They're talking about some of the grants now.
Lastly, in
Much then will we expect in the future on that?
Disputes here, this is particularly interesting. This is one of the things that they've had to take a much closer look at. There's a lot of disputed costs. Partly this is because of the disparate range of contracts that are used to, there's this bridge builder, there's this metal provider, et cetera. And at the state level, my understanding is that that's managed in a fairly inconsistent way. It can lead to a lot of disputes over what the costs and what the contracts are billed at. There's also changing requirements. So they are constantly discovering like, oh, we moved this telephone pole over here. We actually need to move it over there. And that means the viaduct goes this way instead of that way, or other changes to the construction that's going on. And you can imagine that if the requirements are changed and you end up doing $50 million work for something you said you charged $30 million for, there's going to be some sort of dispute in the expense of the effort.
Immediately available for bond sales, but for the final 2.2 billion, they required certain prerequisites before we could access those bond funds, including having the Inspector General review our 2023 project update report and issue a report on that.
So you can see here in the cash management, there's a line item for the leftover bond funds from Pop 1A. There's a line item for the cap and trade cash. Rail Property Management Fund, I'm guessing that's like a separate state assembly authorized fund, and probably specifically for right of way if it's called property, if I had to guess.
Bond proceeds. So I want to thank the Inspector General's office for getting that report out in time for us to be able to participate in the spring bond sale.
Mr. Annis, with regards to that report from the Inspector General, would you please ensure that a copy of that goes to all of the board members?
Will do.
Thank you.
Couple other things as we get into the report. The board will notice in the detailed pages that we do incorporate some recent board actions in this F&A reporting. In January, the full board had approved the updated expenditure authorization that included the new federal grants from 2023. For example, that included the budget for the train set procurement that you're going to hear later today. So that full budget is now built into the financial records. And the second thing is we've included a mid-year budget forecast for this fiscal year that ends in June. And we usually do that about this time of year to give an.
Here's a slightly better breakout of sort of construction plans and where the map is. So this is what they're working on here. And you can imagine these end segments both through the mountains here and through the densely populated cities, both San Francisco and then through the mountains down here past Palmdale and LA are going to be really difficult. If they're still struggling to figure out right-of-way issues and like utility relocation issues, which is another big issue, through the flat farmland here, at $30 billion, you can only imagine. I think some of the most recent projected costs for CP2 and CP3 bring the total project budget to like $120, $130 billion. So it's not a cheap effort.
The CPs has been a record year in terms of all the metrics of workers deployed, structures completed, utilities moved, et cetera. So expenditures have come up.
So he cited three things there, which is interesting because it tells you what the priorities for the project metrics tracking are. Number of people working on the project, number of bridges completed. I'm guessing that includes viaduct savings, and number of utilities relocated. So you can learn a lot by the status of a project from what metrics are being reported as project success, right? What the priorities of the projects are. So if you have 1,200 people working on it last year and 1,500 people working on it this year, Great, there's more people working on it, but when is the train going to be usable, right? Utilities moved is an interesting metric because that is an obstacle. Of course, that's a fairly low-hanging piece of fruit. Like, oh, we need to report more utilities moved. Um, that's not a particularly challenging engineering project, even though there's a lot of relevant pipes and things. The question is, if this effort's been going on for 16 years, why weren't those things planned? Why haven't they been addressed by now? That has been picking up and has been doing much better. What was the third thing? Bridges, bridges and viaducts. Huge effort. You'd imagine going through flat farmland, you could do most of it, at flat grade. As it turns out, a significant portion of the rail through this area is on suspended viaducts, or not suspended viaducts, but raised viaducts right above the ground. So basically, it's a significant portion of this length is basically a bridge. It's a really long, bridge for multiple segments. So that is not an easy thing to do from an engineering perspective.
Talk just a little bit about the dispute resolution so that I'm going to, obviously, if
This is something they've come back to a couple of different times in different meetings, is the disputes with respect to the contracts that we were talking about earlier.
what's the process on the dispute resolution in terms of time and that sort of thing?
Sure. Well, first, to be clear, we pay promptly any undisputed amounts in an invoice submittal. So there's no late payment in that case. Again, what's appropriately documented and appropriate to pay. For those disputed items, it really depends on the contract and the issue. Most of these issues are most of these disputes in terms of dollar, I think it's 98, 99% are related to the Dragados invoicing. And this is a longstanding issue where they will invoice issues that have change orders under negotiation. And so we're unable to pay them until those issues are resolved formally through a change order. But some cases they've performed some work, incurred some cost on the work pending the resolution of the change order. And so that's the vast
98, 99% is a really high number for one particular issue.
in the detail on the specific contracts that are subject to disputes, and that's in the detail that's reported. In those cases, the contract manager will continue to work with the contractor if they choose to continue to.
Another interesting and somewhat unique phenomenon here is the sort of errors and deficits they're talking about, either on a month-to-month or year-to-year basis. In a state like California, like the yearly budget is quite big, and so like $100 million, $50 million may seem like a rounding error in a California budget, but when the effort's going on over 16 plus years, you can imagine a lot of these things add up and become of significant concern to the finance committee.
We're coming in.
It's one of the reasons that they focus on it so much.
Budget at a level that assumes all of our positions are filled, but it's fairly typical to have some amount of savings in our administrative budget due to vacancies. And as we've said before, our vacancy rate of 16% is below the state average, which is about 20%. Next slide.
So that's another interesting metric to track, right? How many empty seats do we have? Given how much of the work is contracted out, I'm not sure how much of those are administrative roles or sort of engineering verification roles or design roles. But 60 empty seats on a size project this size, that could be a lot if they're including contracts.
Bullet in the middle of the page, we say, we've finished about 2/3 of the year through February, and which is 66.7% of the fiscal year completed. We've spent 63.4% of our budget for the fiscal year. So that, that indicates we are coming fairly close to target here on our.
This is a pretty healthy distribution. I mean, construction, you can imagine, is the bulk of the engineering work here, and it's coming in at, 70% or say 80%? That's about right. Now, let's see, design build, right of way. Right of way has come down, but it's surprising that more right of way hasn't been addressed by this point for a project that was initially drafted 16 years ago. Assuming this is just for CP1, of course. It's a lot of legal fees. $242 million.
The big construction or design build contracts, we do look to exceed what was in the line item budget for those. So
Yeah, the fact that design and build is only 50% of the construction costs is something of a red flag to me. I wonder how the rest of the items break down. Fiscal year contingency transferred out $345 million. Doesn't make sense to me.
drilling down a little bit by CP for the month of February, the construction or design build contracts specifically spent about 72 million, with CP1 at 20 million, CP23 at 38 million, and CP4 at 13 million. There's no questions. I believe we can move on to the next slide. Total project expenditures to date, about $12.4 billion, about 78% of that being construction. Looking to the bottom.
So there's an interesting enumeration of the federal grants and other funding sources.
Again, a grant award of 25 million with the required state match of 16 million for a 41 million total. And as I mentioned, we did receive about $10 million.
So between the R grant and the federal state partnership grant, that's $5.5 billion. That's a lot of funds.
So that's not here because this is only through February, but future report will start to show those federal dollars coming in. Excuse me. Next slide. Contract and expenditures report. Total number of contracts, total value of contract.
Oof. That's a lot. Total value of active contracts after 16 years. Active contracts are booked more than the original bond. $11 billion. That's a lot of money.
The Caltrans contract related to their
professional services. Oh, this okay. So for small business utilization, I guess more of the construction work's done by medium to large businesses is what this would tell you, Brent.
On the bottom half of the page, a cumulative overall total about 23.4%. And of course, we also report by category, the federal DBE category, disadvantaged business enterprise, about 10%, right at the federal target. DVBE, a disadvantaged business enterprise, about 3.9%. Over the 3% target for that one. And then the cumulative California state micro business and small business coming.
Very rarely do you find federal grants that don't have some sort of conditions attached. So a lot of these things are, if you want, that $3 billion, you need to make sure this percent is allocated to this, that percent is allocated to that, etc. It's not just free money.
And the previous month, like we've had in the past.
Yeah, we do have that as the cumulative or the total at the top chart, bottom of the top chart.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so
it's just up above now. That's fine.
Yeah, so in month over month, it's up really because of those, we pull those expired contracts off in the calculation. Next slide. Okay, so the contingency summary at the top part of the top.
Nearly $3 billion in contingency for CP1. Nearly $3 billion in contingency for the construction package that hasn't even started yet. So that's I don't want to say a red flag, but there's more going on here, right? That may be because you're building through, in particular, densely populated urban areas. They expect they will need a lot of cash on hand once construction does start for right away.
30 million in those CP specific contingencies. At the bottom half of that same table, we also list other contingencies, and we have a unallocated
It's an empty table there.
$110 million that's also available to the broad program as needed. We'll mention, as was referenced in public comment, Daniel Horgan in his presentation and in that material, just give a few months look ahead. I will note, I think the construction folks are probably have the best forecasting ability. They have a better view of what's coming.
This always does jump out at me when you see enumerations like this, like other contingency, unallocated, let's say cumulative authorized so far is $82 million, right? Interim use, it's a little vague, but $54 million for project reserve, that's fine. And then other. And other is more than half of everything else combined. Like, someone might need a little more imagination to come up with other contingency categories if other contingency other is $168 million authorized.
We still put out a monthly report in March and sent it to the board members. So that included January data. And so there was some detail on change orders as well for that January period. And that's in the report that we call the March report that went out. It's on our website as well. Those change orders, the larger of those was reported as well in the CO reports and to the full board in prior meetings as well. Next slide, please. This is our preliminary data on the month of March. Our total construction expenditures or capital.
It's a little bit in California, but typically when you see capital outlays for construction, it's very seasonal. So month to month is, I don't want to say meaningless, but seeing year over year trends would be much more useful here. Especially for federal grants. Like, who breaks down federal grants on a month to month basis? Those are also authorized by fiscal year, right?
Meeting to get the most recent information we can. Again, the DB expenditure specifically, in total about the same, about $68 million in DB expenditures in.
Interesting. So those vacancy rates are purely for administrative positions. I wonder how much that's holding them back. I also wonder, given how much of the sort of post-bond reliance is dependent on federal grants, to what degree in recent years the project funding has been impacted by like CRs, continuing resolutions, and whether or not those flow down to dependent state projects like this one.
So that's about the same overall month over month. Not much to report on the bottom of the page. Vacancy rates stay about the same. And then for the federal grant summary, the federal government did complete all of their grant awards for the 2023 grant applications. And of course, we ended up with about 3.3 billion in across 4 different grant awards. But now we're looking ahead to new applications we're submitting in 2024. And the 16 million that shows up here in the bottom right table, that is a RAISE grant we submitted in February for the design, 100% design of the Merced station. And next week, we plan to submit a grant request for $60 million to a U.S. Department of Energy program for grid resilience, electrical grid resilience. It's sort of an unusual.
One of the things, even in California, you'll see when you look at projects like this is you have to find money wherever you can, right? Each year racks up more and more billions of dollars of expenses, and you need to, like, if that grant, if the government's saying, hey, you can have $1 billion if you make sure the electric grid is powered by 50% renewables, like, you get that money, right? There's a very interesting book called The Power Broker, biography of Robert Moses, and one of the things that strikes you when you read about this guy who sort of ruled the engineering landscape of mid-century, early 20th century New York with an iron fist, is how creative he could get with respect to where funding was coming from. In particular, what is it, the Parkway along the west side of Manhattan, Hudson Parkway, I think. Like, there was no way the city was going to be able to fund that, right? Even at the time, it was like 10 billions of dollars, and nowadays probably an order of magnitude more than that. So he would find $1.5 billion from Albany here, and there would be $2.5 billion he could scrape from the government there, for the federal government there, from his friends in Washington, and then some other bond could be raised to get, $500,000 here. Like a lot of this funding, you see how it's being spent, but you don't see how many ways the funding is coming into the project to make sure that it can keep paying the bills after the original, in this case, especially after the original bond has expired. I do not want to use that as a positive example, by the way. If you read the Power Broker, you'll find that that was not a particularly great guy, Robert Moses. And a lot of people blame him for a lot of stuff, and they are well justified for doing so. But if you want to look at sort of where reality meets large civic projects, how they're funded, how they're managed, how they're executed, it's very, very interesting insight.
We ought to fire you in advance.
I unmuted at the wrong time.
I can book some vacation next month. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So enjoy your last meeting.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
Jump back there. What did I miss?
Last
Books.
people, I don't know that it isn't. So the reason we're smiling up here is because I don't know that it's been announced, but I don't know that the public has noted, but our chief financial officer is going to hang up his boots at the end of
Oh.
June. So the CEO just suggested maybe we ought to fire you in advance.
Ow.
I can book some vacation next month. Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
You can imagine for finance and auditing committee, the CFO is probably a pretty important role. I do think it's interesting and somewhat ironic that they call it the finance and auditing committee. Like auditing is something you typically do to the finances, right? They mentioned some auditing done by the state IG at the beginning. Glad it's a clean scorecard. But as a taxpayer in California, it would be much more interesting to see a full audit by like a third-party accounting firm to the finances, as opposed to the fox guarding the hen house, so to speak. Here, there's potential conflict of interest there. Glad it was not done by them, though. The auditing was at least done by the state IG.
In the month of February, we executed a total of 21 change orders for a value of 38 million. The biggest of these change orders was for the Nebraska Avenue.
I like this guy, by the way. He comes out consistently as well, but his accent's a lot of fun to listen to.
0.5 million. Okay, in terms of risk contingency, as Brian said earlier, our risk contingency balance at the end of February was just over 1 billion. In terms of construction labor, again, a reasonably good month in February, slightly down on.
Interesting that construction expenditures in February were almost twice as much for construction package 2 and 3, which again is those urban ends, as it was for the Central Valley. Wonder if that means construction's winding down, like if they finished most of the physical construction, because I know they haven't started anything, right, on the ends.
91 miles of guideway in construction. So that's 35 miles underway and 56 miles completed. In terms of utility relocations, we hit a new milestone. We have now 70% of all utilities relocated. Another 15% are in the process of being relocated, and another 15% haven't started.
So I've listened into about 3 of these so far, and I can never remember how consistent these numbers are. I should go in and look at how it breaks out each month, because obviously you always want to present the numbers as if they're increasing, right? We're making progress. Great. In this case, the fact that this project started in 2008 and 15% of utility relocations haven't started, is that a funding issue? Is that scope of work issue? Is that changing requirements issue? Is that so utilities can mean a lot of things. Power is obviously an important one. That's usually strung up, right, or underground. Sewage is even more difficult because it's one thing to restring wires, but for pipes, that's a significantly greater effort. One that I keep on coming back though is telecommunications, and those are obviously privately managed. It's not like public utilities or anything, but they're also modernized at a much higher frequency. So if this project started in 2008, there were bulk of the telecommunications utilities that trying to locate were probably put up in the past 5 to 10 years. So a little bit of foresight probably could have gone in and addressed some of these issues with respect to telecommunications relocation efforts.
For each of the CPs, and which element of those between right-of-way, utility, and construction status, where they are, green, yellow, red, and you can see it in those pages in the business plan.
So, but that would be helpful if we would start, just include that in all of the,
Interesting. So railroad parcels, I imagine that's for the actual grades. So it's not just, you know, we need to get this ancillary ground or this moved here or over there. It's the actual right of way for the rails and the viaducts. And what, 23 parcels still remaining? And that's just for CP1, if I'm not mistaken.
And conveyance rights. Okay, in terms of real property, we delivered one more parcel to the design builders. So we have now delivered a total of 2,261 parcels to the design build contractors. Next slide, please. Okay, in terms of environmental clearance, the big headline here is Palmdale to Burbank. We are finalizing the
So a lot of those bookend CPs are still like environmental reviews and community impact, community reports. You can imagine that's a pretty big deal in these densely populated urban areas.
development, which Christine Inouye is leading. We're advancing the design both on the Merced extension and the Bakersfield extension. So the 30% design is advancing. And following the board approval, we will be also issuing a notice to proceed to advance detailed design for both the Merced and Bakersfield extension. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide shows the histogram of contractors' expenditures. It's a combination of CP1 to CP4. As you can see, February was 72 million, January was 42 million. So the reason for January being particularly low, there's several reasons, but
I do wonder why they bundle design and build. Usually, at least in sort of software experience, where there's design and development, and deployment, or operations and sustainment, goes by different terms in different sectors. I'd imagine at this point most of this would be build, right? But seeing the breakout would probably help.
balance of 9.
One of the reasons they may bundle it is because a lot of that is probably offloaded to independent contractors and design and architecture firms, if I had to guess. But I strongly suspect those are still like separate contracts and separate awards.
But it's going to, you will see in the flash report, it's picked up significantly in March. We anticipate that construction.
This is another metric they keep coming back to, is how many people are working on it, right? And if that corresponds to miles of track laid, that's great.
Slide basically shows the structures and the guideway. The top solid blue line is the structure.
If I was sort of chief engineer in this project, I would want to see how many miles of total miles in a CP are graded, how many miles have rail laid, and how many miles are ready, functional, right? Like, so powered, maintained. If you want, or if you had the rolling stock, you could send the rolling stock down. I think those would probably be a little more interesting for an engineer at least.
So now we have relocated a total of 1,284 utilities. We have another 200.
Is starting the year report here is supposed to be like the past 12 months at January, so there's only 2 months to show. That's not something they've done in previous months. That's a red flag to me. So okay, here's the utility relocation, right? Okay, telecom's 100%. That's great. That's what I would. Oh wait, no, everything's 100%. I'm looking at the wrong column. Let's see, as a percent, they only do the total percents there, don't they? Okay, 84% relocated. Not started 5% for telecom. Not started 14% for fluid. 21% not started for gas. Yeah, I can imagine gas would be tricky. 25% not started for electric? That surprises me. That surprises me.
Okay, the slide shows the delivery of right-of-way. So only 26 parcels of right-of-way left for CP 1 to 4. So we are nearing in on completion. And there was one part.
That is impressive, given that they include CPs 2, 3, 4 in the diagram. I don't know if those total numbers are going to stay constant. There's still going to be changes. There's still going to be, like, if they're still listening to environmental impacts and community reports, like, the plans will change, right? You'll need to acquire different parcels of land, or you need other right-of-ways. Those numbers will still go up.
This slide shows the delivery of railroad parcels. So we've delivered 153 railroad parcels to date, 23 outstanding. These are all on target to be delivered to ensure that we remain on schedule. So no delays here. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is the CP1 earned value slide.
This is bread and butter for engineering management. Time and money tracked either as a burn down to 0% or up to 100%. You have basic plus and minus some risk of schedule delays, and like any other control metric, right? You have a pathway and you're trying to control to that pathway. What happens when it goes below? What happens when it goes above? That's a very common view that you'll see.
Bananas. But these are the preliminary figures for the month of March. So we'll have to book a holiday together.
Okay.
Okay, so in terms of construction was up significantly. We had 1,486 construction workers on site, which was a very strong figure. We delivered another parcel of land to design build contractors, and we executed 13 change orders as well. And we did relocate again 28 utilities in the month of March. So a pretty good March. Thank you. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Daniel, just a general question going forward. As we design these extensions to Merced and Bakersfield, will you assure me we're not going to do this as a design build?
Yes, they're going to be design bid build contracts, or maybe in one case we might do a CMGC.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Interesting, CMGC. I'm not familiar with that term. I don't want to look it up. Design bid build, I'm guessing, means you have different people bidding on the work that has been designed, as opposed to packaging it together. Probably be easier to report, or at least make more sense to report.
Fairly new contracts, and we have an industry update on the 7th of May, where we'll be talking about all the contracts that are coming out in the next 2 or 3 years.
Any other questions for Mr. Horgan? Seeing none, thank you, Daniel, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.
And ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the agendized items for the Finance and Audit Committee today. Please join us, if you will, at 9:30 for the board meeting. With that, the Finance and Audit Committee is adjourned.
All right, so there we are.
Good morning.
What have we learned? It's a complex effort, right? A big part of the challenge is the fact that the goalposts are moving. The fact that so much of the bond money has been spent, so other funding sources have to be cobbled together. That's not unusual in civic projects. One thing I do want to point out is that there's for really difficult engineering projects, there's sort of two perspectives, two approaches that you can take. You can start off by doing the easy part and learn as you go, and then sort of incrementally expand. And that's the approach being taken here, right? Central Valley is definitely the easy part. It's all flat. It's all farmland. Of course, there's very little utility in that. So if you look at, from an accounting perspective, what sort of ridership numbers they book, for example, like they're completely unrealistic. No one's going to want to drive from Los Angeles up to Bakersfield to take a train to Fresno or Merced. And then, maybe take a bus over to San Francisco, when you could hop on a $60 Southwest special and be there in 40 minutes, or an hour. I'm getting dangerously close to ranting, but suffice it to say. So that's one approach you can take to these large complex engineering projects, is to identify the easy part and start to do that. The big risk there is that you end up front loading a lot of your expenses and then you run out of money. And not only do you run out of money, even if you don't run out of money, you find that because things become more difficult, you need more time and more money, even once the easy part is finished. Another approach is sort of the complete opposite of this, and that is identify the hardest part and do the hardest part first. And if you can get the hardest part out of the way and figure out the hardest part, then everything else will be smooth and easy. One of my favorite examples of this is if you look at Hyman Rickover developing nuclear-powered submarines. We had nuclear-powered submarines before we had nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. And that would have been much easier to have a surface vessel with, figure out the reactors and how they work and then try and put it on a submarine, right? But because we started with the submarines, this was Rickover's approach, and figured out all of the most difficult and pressing problems in a very, zero margin for error, safety critical environment when you're 1,000 feet below the water. In a very tightly confined space where nothing can possibly go wrong. Once you had that, it was very easy to take that technology and not only put in aircraft carriers, but even put in like cruisers or other surface vessels. So the advantage to that approach here, and I think this is probably one of the things that you would want to change is, if you start with the most difficult parts of California high-speed rail, and you start with, for example, high-speed from San Francisco, San Jose, Sacramento, and then on the other end, just as a completely separate rail system, like high-speed from Los Angeles to San Diego, through Anaheim or Riverside, those are much more difficult efforts, but not only do you get the difficult parts out of the way, although another part of the difficulties is the mountain ranges around those areas. Assume that those can be addressed as needed. You also have much better ridership projections, right? People actually use that to go to work in downtown LA. So that may be more self-sustaining in terms of revenue. But certainly in terms of accounting and what ridership numbers you're booking, that would probably be more realistic. I did not know that the IG was taking a look. As I mentioned before, I'd probably want to see auditing reviews from a third-party accounting instead, but that's better than nothing. And then the sensitivity to external funding sources is a big deal as well. It will be very interesting. You noticed under one of those diagrams we saw this line here. Florida was able to do I want to say it's a private rail called Brightline. It's a traditional diesel electric, but up to 100 miles an hour, pretty speedy, in a much shorter amount of time. So I believe they started after Prop 1A passed, and they finished like a couple of years ago, and then extended it to Orlando recently. So that same effort, it's a little bit more privatized, so I don't know how it works with like state bond funds. It may not be something you can do with state bond funds without establishing a separate authority. They're going to try and replicate it here in this Brightline West effort. And again, this could be easier because it's not even through farmland, right? This is through mostly flat Mojave. So depending on when they start, they have like $8 or $10 billion raised. I want to say it's mostly like VCs. You can imagine that would have pretty good ridership, right? Of course, getting to the train stations is still a difficult issue if you're living in like LA trying to get out to Ontario or have you or Victorville, but not quite a race yet, but it will be a very interesting comparison to make and to see what sort of engineering decisions are made and how the programs and projects are managed. They may take a completely different contracting approach, for example, from the beginning, as we heard them mention toward the end. But I would not mind doing more of these. I'll probably do at least financing and auditing every 3 months when they come up with the new reports. But hopefully the quality of the video worked out a little bit better this time, and I can actually throw this one up. I'll do my best to write it up and come up with some better documents, etc. But that is it for today. Hope we learned a little bit of something. We'll see how this progresses. Maybe compare some numbers for the next time. Take care.